Carl Jung discovered something extraordinary about the human psyche that changes everything you thought you knew about spiritual awakening. He identified 7 unmistakable signs that you're not experiencing a breakdown, but rather a breakthrough into what he called evolutionary consciousness. And here's what makes this discovery so powerful. If you recognize even half of these signs, you're not losing yourself. You're finding the version of yourself that collective conditioning has kept hidden for your entire life. What you're about to discover will transform how you understand the isolation, the confusion, and the profound sense of being different that you've been experiencing. Jung uncovered something that modern psychology still struggles to accept. The discomfort you're feeling isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that your consciousness is evolving beyond the limitations that keep most people trapped in unconscious patterns. Yes, this evolution feels difficult right now, but Jung documented what comes after this transitional darkness, and it's more extraordinary than anything spiritual teachers promise. But before we explore Jung's 7 signs of evolutionary consciousness, I need to ask you something that might completely reframe your entire experience. Have you been interpreting your growing inability to participate in normal social reality as personal failure, when it's actually evidence of psychological evolution? Have you been seeing your deepening awareness as a curse, when Jung understood it as preparation for a level of consciousness that only a small percentage of humanity ever achieves? Drop a comment and tell me which sign of consciousness evolution you recognize most strongly in yourself. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Jung discovered about the transformation you're experiencing will help you understand that you're not broken, you're breaking through. Share this with anyone who's been struggling with feeling too different, too sensitive, too aware. They need to know that what they're experiencing has a name, a purpose, and most importantly, a positive resolution. After watching, comment where you're from and which evolutionary stage you recognize yourself in. Let's build a community of people who understand that evolution sometimes feels like exile, but it's actually preparation for something extraordinary. Jung's most revolutionary discovery emerged from observing patients who seemed to be suffering from what other psychologists called adjustment disorders or social dysfunction. But Jung recognized something that his colleagues missed entirely. These individuals weren't failing to adapt to society. They were succeeding at something far more important. They were individuating, developing consciousness beyond collective programming, evolving into what Jung termed psychologically sovereign individuals. And here's what Jung found that should give you profound hope. Every single person who successfully navigated this transition emerged with capabilities, insights, and psychological strength that far exceeded anything they possessed before the transformation began. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the evolutionary imperative, the psyche's inherent drive toward greater consciousness, deeper authenticity, and more complete self-realization. He observed that certain individuals, for reasons he believed were both psychological and spiritual, undergo accelerated development that pushes them beyond collective consciousness into territories of awareness that most people never explore. And while this journey is undeniably challenging, Jung was absolutely clear about something. This isn't pathology, it's potential actualizing itself. Think about what's been happening to you recently. You've probably felt increasingly alienated from normal social interactions, progressively less interested in things that used to bring you pleasure, more and more aware of depths and dimensions in reality that others seem completely blind to. You've likely interpreted these changes as evidence that something is wrong, that you're becoming depressed, antisocial, or psychologically unstable. But what if Jung was right? What if every single symptom you've been experiencing is actually your psyche's way of pushing you toward a level of consciousness that transcends everything you've known before? Here's where Jung's observations become genuinely exciting, rather than disturbing. He documented that people undergoing this evolutionary transition consistently report feeling like they're dying psychologically, like their old self is dissolving, like they're losing connection with everything that once felt stable and real. But Jung recognized this as psychological metamorphosis, the necessary destruction of limited identity that must occur before expanded consciousness can emerge. Just as a caterpillar must dissolve completely inside the cocoon before emerging as a butterfly, your old self must dissolve before your evolved self can emerge. Modern psychology is beginning to validate Jung's insights in ways that should give you genuine hope. Research on post-traumatic growth shows that individuals who undergo significant psychological challenges often emerge with enhanced capabilities, including deeper empathy, greater psychological resilience, more authentic relationships, and a stronger sense of meaning and purpose. What looks like breakdown from the outside is often breakthrough from the inside. You're not falling apart, you're being restructured at a fundamental level. Jung observed something crucial about this evolutionary process that changes everything. The difficulties you're experiencing are temporary, but the capabilities you're developing are permanent. The isolation you feel now is transitional. The enhanced awareness you're gaining is forever. You're trading temporary social comfort for permanent psychological sovereignty, and Jung believed this is always a worthwhile exchange, even though it doesn't feel that way in the middle of the transition. Let me reveal the first sign of what Jung called evolutionary consciousness, and as I describe each one, I'll show you not just what you're experiencing, but what it's preparing you for. Because Jung understood that every challenge in this process is actually building a specific capability that you'll need for the extraordinary life that awaits you on the other side of this transformation. Sign 1. You see through people's psychological masks, and while it exhausts you now, it's developing your capacity for authentic connection. Jung discovered something profound about what he called differentiated perception, the ability to see beyond social performances into people's authentic psychological states. When you first develop this ability, it feels overwhelming and isolating. You can't unsee what you see. You can't participate in surface-level interactions without feeling physically and emotionally drained. But here's what Jung understood about this phase that changes everything. This exhaustion is temporary, and what you're developing is the foundation for the deepest, most authentic relationships that humans can experience. Jung observed that people in the early stages of differentiated perception feel burdened by their insight. They see through everyone's masks, and it makes normal social interaction feel impossible. But Jung documented what happens when people successfully integrate this capability. They develop what he called conscious discernment, the ability to see clearly while maintaining compassion, to perceive truth while respecting others' developmental stages, to recognize performance without judgment. Here's where this gets genuinely exciting. Jung found people who successfully navigate this phase emerge with an extraordinary gift. They become able to create what he termed psychological holding space, environments where others feel safe enough to drop their masks and show their authentic selves. You're not developing the ability to see through people to make you perpetually isolated. You're developing it so that you can eventually facilitate the kind of authentic connection that most people desperately crave, but don't know how to create. Think about what this means for your future relationships. Right now, seeing through everyone's performances feels like a burden that separates you from others. But Jung observed that people who integrate this capability eventually become magnets for authentic connection. Because in a world full of performance, someone who can see through masks without judgment, who can hold space for authenticity without requiring it, becomes incredibly valuable. You're not being prepared for permanent isolation. You're being prepared to facilitate genuine connection at levels most people never experience. But here's what Jung found most important about successfully navigating this phase. You need to recognize that what you're experiencing is a transitional challenge, not a permanent condition. Right now, you're overwhelmed by seeing too much, because you haven't yet developed the psychological structures to process what you perceive. It's like suddenly gaining the ability to hear sounds that were always there, but you couldn't hear before. At first, the noise is overwhelming, but gradually, you learn to filter, to focus, to use this enhanced perception as a tool rather than experiencing it as a burden. Jung identified 3 stages people move through with differentiated perception. First, overwhelming awareness, where you see everything and it exhausts you. Second, developing filters, where you learn what to pay attention to and what to let pass. Third, integrated discernment, where your perception becomes a gift you can use consciously rather than a curse you experience passively. You're in stage 1 right now, but stages 2 and 3 are coming, and they transform this burden into one of your greatest strengths. Have you been feeling exhausted by your ability to see through social performances? Write in the comments, "I'm developing discernment," because naming this as a developmental process rather than a permanent problem begins the shift toward integration. Sign 2. Silence has become more meaningful than most conversations, and this is developing your capacity for depth. Jung identified something profound about what he called the evolution of communication needs. As consciousness develops, many people experience a period where words feel increasingly inadequate, where most conversations seem shallow, where silence feels more honest than speech. Jung understood this, not as social withdrawal, but as consciousness, recognizing that the level of communication it now requires doesn't exist in most social contexts yet. Here's what makes this genuinely exciting rather than depressing. Jung observed that people who go through this phase of preferring silence to shallow conversation eventually develop something extraordinary. They become what he called communication catalysts, individuals who can facilitate depth in dialogue that transforms every conversation they participate in. You're not losing your ability to connect through language. You're developing higher standards for communication that will eventually help you create conversations of profound meaning and authenticity. Jung documented that people in this transitional phase often feel torn between 2 equally uncomfortable options: participate in conversations that feel meaningless, or withdraw into isolation to protect their energy. But Jung observed what happens when people successfully navigate this phase. They develop what I call depth facilitation, the ability to gently guide conversations from surface to substance, to ask questions that invite authentic sharing, to create space where meaningful dialogue becomes natural rather than forced. Think about what this capability will mean for every relationship in your future. Right now, you're frustrated because most conversations feel hollow, and you don't yet have the skills to transform them. But Jung found that people who successfully integrate this phase emerge with an extraordinary ability. They can meet people where they are, while gently inviting them deeper, creating conversations that others remember as the most meaningful exchanges they've ever had. Here's where Jung's observations become truly hopeful. The preference for silence you're experiencing isn't preparing you for a life of isolation. It's preparing you for a life where every conversation you choose to have carries genuine depth and meaning. You're developing quality over quantity in communication, and while that feels lonely now, Jung observed that it leads to relationships characterized by profound authentic connection, rather than frequent shallow interaction. But Jung also identified something crucial about successfully navigating this phase. You need to recognize that your current discomfort with normal conversation is transitional. You're between 2 stages. You've outgrown surface-level communication, but haven't yet developed the skills to create depth in dialogue. This in-between space feels isolating, but it's temporary. As you develop confidence in facilitating deeper conversation, as you learn to guide others gently into more meaningful exchange, the isolation transforms into selective, high-quality connection. Have you been choosing silence because most conversations feel empty? Write in the comments, I'm developing depth, because recognizing this as skill development, rather than social failure, begins the transformation toward integrated capacity. Sign 3. Your empathy transformed into profound perception, and this is developing your healing presence. Jung made a distinction that modern psychology still doesn't fully appreciate. He differentiated between reactive empathy, where you feel what others feel and become overwhelmed by it, and perceptive empathy, where you see what others need with clarity that allows you to actually help. The transition between these two types of empathy feels overwhelming, but Jung observed that what you're developing is one of the most valuable capabilities humans can possess. Here's what Jung understood about this phase that should give you genuine hope. Right now, you're seeing everyone's pain, everyone's defenses, everyone's shadow material, and it feels like a burden because you don't yet have the boundaries and skills to work with what you perceive. But Jung documented what happens when people successfully integrate this enhanced perception. They develop what he called therapeutic presence, the ability to see deeply while maintaining psychological boundaries, to perceive others' wounds while not taking responsibility for healing them, to offer insight without creating dependency. Jung observed that people who successfully navigate this transitional phase emerge with an extraordinary gift. They become what he termed natural healers, not because they fix others, but because their presence creates psychological safety, where others can heal themselves. You're not developing this perception to burden you forever. You're developing it so that eventually your very presence will facilitate healing and growth in others. Think about what this means for your future impact. Right now, seeing everyone's psychological reality feels exhausting because you're perceiving without boundaries, understanding without the skills to help effectively. But Jung found that people who integrate this capability eventually become the kind of person others seek out during their darkest moments, not because you have all the answers, but because you can see them clearly while still believing in their capacity to heal and grow. Here's where this gets genuinely exciting. Jung observed that people with integrated perceptive empathy often report that their presence alone seems to help others, even without words or active intervention. They develop what Jung called psychological resonance, where their own integrated consciousness creates a field that invites others into greater wholeness. You're being prepared to become a healing presence, not through what you do, but through who you're becoming. But Jung identified something crucial about successfully navigating this phase. You must learn what he called sacred boundaries, the ability to see others' pain without taking it into yourself, to perceive psychological truth without feeling responsible for fixing it, to offer presence without offering rescue. This skill takes time to develop, but it's what transforms overwhelming perception into genuine healing capacity. Have you been overwhelmed by seeing everyone's psychological reality? Write in the comments, I'm developing healing presence, because naming this as a capability you're developing, rather than a burden you're stuck with, begins the shift toward integration. Sign 4. You feel disconnected from your former self, and this is creating space for authentic identity. Jung identified what he called psychological rebirth, the necessary dissolution of conditioned identity that must occur before authentic selfhood can emerge. What you're experiencing isn't identity loss, it's identity evolution. Your old self was constructed largely from social programming, family expectations, cultural conditioning. That self is dissolving, not because something is wrong, but because something is finally going right. Here's what Jung discovered that should transform how you understand what you're experiencing. Every authentic identity must go through what he called the liminal phase, a period of being between identities, where the old self has dissolved, but the new self hasn't fully formed yet. This phase feels terrifying, because you're experiencing psychological groundlessness, but Jung observed that this groundlessness is absolutely necessary for genuine transformation. Jung documented what happens when people successfully navigate this liminal phase. They emerge with what he termed authentic selfhood, an identity based not on social expectations or conditioned responses, but on genuine self-knowledge and conscious choice. Right now, you feel lost because you don't know who you are anymore. But Jung understood this not knowing as the birthplace of real knowing, the dissolution of false identity that creates space for true identity to emerge. Think about what this means for your future sense of self. Right now, you're in the most uncomfortable part of transformation, the part where the old has died, but the new hasn't fully been born. But Jung observed that people who successfully navigate this phase emerge with something extraordinary, unshakable self-knowledge, an identity that can't be destabilized by others' opinions or life's changes, because it's rooted in authentic self-understanding rather than external validation. Here's where Jung's insights become genuinely hopeful. The identity crisis you're experiencing is temporary, but the authentic selfhood you're developing is permanent. You're trading a stable but inauthentic identity for an initially unstable but ultimately unshakable authentic identity. And Jung believed this trade is always worthwhile, even though the transition period is genuinely difficult. Jung identified what he called identity integration practices that help people navigate this phase successfully. Journaling to track how you're changing, creative expression to give form to your emerging self, spending time alone to listen to your authentic impulses without social influence. These practices help accelerate the transition from identity dissolution to identity emergence. Have you been feeling lost about who you really are? Write in the comments, "I'm becoming authentic," because framing this as becoming rather than losing transforms crisis into opportunity. Sign 5. Normal sources of meaning feel empty, and this is preparing you for authentic purpose. Jung made a crucial distinction between what he called synthetic meaning, purpose derived from social programming and external validation, and authentic meaning, purpose emerging from genuine self-knowledge and conscious alignment. What you're experiencing isn't meaninglessness. It's the dissolution of false meaning that's creating space for real meaning to emerge. Here's what Jung observed that should give you profound hope. Every person who successfully navigates what he called the meaning crisis emerges with a sense of purpose, so strong, so clear, so aligned with their authentic nature that it becomes essentially unshakable. Right now, you feel empty because old sources of meaning have died, but new ones haven't emerged yet. But Jung documented that this void is temporary, and what eventually emerges from it is far more satisfying than anything you've experienced before. Jung found that people in this transitional phase often feel frustrated because they can see that normal goals feel hollow, but they can't yet perceive what would feel genuinely meaningful. This is what Jung called the fertile void, the uncomfortable but necessary space where authentic purpose can take root. You're not experiencing permanent meaninglessness. You're experiencing temporary groundlessness that's preparing you for unshakable purpose. Think about what this means for your future life direction. Right now, you feel directionless because you've outgrown synthetic meaning, but haven't yet discovered authentic meaning. But Jung observed that people who successfully navigate this phase emerge with crystal clear purpose, with goals that feel genuinely aligned with their nature, with a sense of meaning that doesn't require external validation to feel real. Here's where this gets genuinely exciting. Jung documented that authentic meaning, once discovered, is far more resilient than synthetic meaning. Synthetic meaning collapses when circumstances change or others disapprove. Authentic meaning remains stable because it's rooted in genuine self-knowledge and conscious alignment rather than external validation. Have you been feeling empty about goals that used to matter? Write in the comments, "I'm discovering authentic purpose," because naming this as discovery rather than loss transforms the experience. Sign 6. You're drawn to depth and shadow, and this is developing your psychological wholeness. Jung revolutionized psychology by recognizing that psychological health requires integrating shadow material, not transcending it. What you're experiencing isn't morbid fascination with darkness, it's consciousness recognizing that wholeness requires embracing what's been repressed, understanding what's been denied, integrating what's been rejected. Here's what Jung understood about this phase. People who successfully integrate their shadow material develop what he called psychological wholeness, a completeness that includes both light and dark, both strength and vulnerability, both success and failure. Right now, your attraction to shadow material might feel concerning, like something is wrong with you. But Jung observed that this is actually evidence of health, of consciousness refusing to settle for the fragmented half-self that most people accept. Jung documented what happens when people successfully navigate shadow integration. They emerge with extraordinary psychological strength because they're no longer spending energy repressing parts of themselves. They develop genuine compassion because they've accepted their own darkness and can therefore accept others' darkness. They become psychologically resilient because they're no longer afraid of their own depths. Think about what this means for your future psychological capacity. Right now, you're exploring territories of your psyche that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but Jung observed that this discomfort is temporary, and what you're building through this exploration is permanent psychological integration that most people never achieve. Have you been drawn to exploring your shadow? Write in the comments, "I'm becoming whole," because naming this as integration rather than obsession transforms your relationship with the process. Sign 7. You feel separated from collective consciousness, and this is developing your sovereignty. Jung made perhaps his most important observation here: individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self, necessarily creates temporary separation from collective identification before it creates authentic connection based on wholeness rather than conformity. What you're experiencing isn't permanent exile, it's transitional separation that's preparing you for authentic belonging. Here's what Jung discovered that should transform how you understand your isolation. Every person who successfully completes individuation goes through a period where they feel fundamentally separated from normal social reality. But Jung documented what comes after this separation, the development of what he called psychological sovereignty, the ability to be authentically yourself while remaining compassionately connected to others, to maintain your individuality while contributing to collective good. Jung observed that people in this transitional phase often feel torn between two equally unsatisfying options: conform to fit in and betray your authentic self, or remain authentic and accept isolation. But Jung documented that this is a false dichotomy. What actually happens when you successfully complete individuation is that you develop the capacity for authentic belonging, connection-based, not on conformity, but on genuine mutual recognition between sovereign individuals. Think about what this means for your future relationships and sense of belonging. Right now, you feel isolated because you've grown beyond collective identification, but haven't yet found authentic community. But Jung observed that people who complete this process often report having fewer relationships, but far deeper connections, less social activity, but far more meaningful interactions, smaller communities, but genuine mutual recognition. Here's where Jung's observations become genuinely hopeful. The isolation you're experiencing is temporary, but the sovereignty you're developing is permanent. You're trading comfortable conformity for uncomfortable authenticity, and while that transition feels isolating, Jung found that it leads to connections far more satisfying than anything conformity-based belonging can provide. Jung documented that people who successfully complete individuation often become what he called bridges, individuals who can move between collective consciousness and individual sovereignty, who can participate in social reality without losing themselves, who can contribute to collective good while maintaining authentic identity. You're not being prepared for permanent exile, you're being prepared to serve as a bridge between where consciousness is and where it's going. Have you been feeling exiled from normal social reality? Write in the comments, "I'm developing sovereignty," because naming this as development rather than failure transforms isolation into necessary preparation. Remember these 7 signs, because if you recognized even 4 in your own experience, you're not suffering from psychological illness or spiritual failure. You're undergoing what Jung called individuation, the natural but challenging process of becoming your authentic self. And here's what Jung was absolutely clear about. Every person who successfully navigates this process emerges stronger, clearer, more authentic, and more capable than they were before the transformation began. The 7 signs we've explored aren't symptoms of pathology, they're markers of evolution. You see through masks because you're developing discernment. You prefer silence because you're developing depth. Your empathy intensified because you're developing healing presence. You feel disconnected from your old self because you're becoming authentic. Normal meaning feels empty because you're discovering real purpose. You're drawn to shadow because you're becoming whole. You feel separated because you're developing sovereignty. Jung understood that this evolutionary process moves through predictable stages. First, disruption, where your old patterns stop working and you feel lost. Second, dissolution, where your old identity breaks down and you feel like you're falling apart. Third, the void, where old meaning has died, but new meaning hasn't emerged, and you feel empty. Fourth, emergence, where new identity, new meaning, new capabilities begin to form. Fifth, integration, where you consolidate your gains and begin living from your new consciousness level. If you're in the first 3 stages right now, everything feels difficult, and you might be questioning whether this journey is worth it. But Jung documented thousands of cases of people who moved through all 5 stages, and he was clear about something. Every single person who completed the process reported that it was absolutely worth it. The capabilities you develop, the authenticity you achieve, the consciousness you gain, these are worth the temporary difficulty of the transition. Jung identified specific practices that help people navigate this evolutionary process successfully. First, maintain some structure, even when everything feels chaotic. Routine activities that ground you while your psyche transforms. Second, create space for regular solitude, where you can process what's happening without social pressure. Third, find at least one person who understands evolutionary consciousness and can witness your process without trying to fix or change you. Fourth, engage in creative expression to give form to your emerging self. Fifth, be patient with yourself, recognizing that this process can't be rushed and has its own natural timing. But Jung also warned about what derails this process. First, trying to return to your old identity because the transition feels too uncomfortable. Second, judging yourself for the difficulties you're experiencing. Third, isolating completely rather than maintaining at least some social connection. Fourth, rushing the process or trying to force integration before it's ready to emerge naturally. Fifth, comparing your timeline to others' timelines rather than trusting your own process. If you're experiencing these 7 signs of evolutionary consciousness, Jung's guidance is clear. First, recognize what's happening to you as development, not deterioration. Second, be patient with the process, understanding that consciousness evolution has its own timing. Third, maintain some structure and social connection, even though it feels difficult. Fourth, create regular space for solitude and self-reflection. Fifth, trust that what's dissolving needed to dissolve so something more authentic can emerge. Jung believed that people undergoing this evolutionary process serve a crucial function for humanity. You're not just personally evolving, you're pioneering pathways of consciousness that eventually become available to the collective. Every time someone successfully navigates individuation, they make it slightly easier for the next person. You're not suffering meaninglessly. You're suffering in service of consciousness evolution, both your own and humanity's. Your evolutionary journey isn't punishment or pathology. It's preparation. You're being prepared for a level of consciousness, authenticity, and capability that most people never achieve. Yes, the preparation is difficult, but Jung documented that what awaits you on the other side of this transformation is worth every moment of difficulty you're experiencing now. The 7 signs of evolutionary consciousness aren't evidence that something is wrong with you. They're evidence that something is finally going right. Your psyche is pushing you toward your highest potential, and while that push feels uncomfortable, it's motivated by your system's inherent drive toward wholeness, authenticity, and full self-realization. If you recognize these signs in yourself and have been interpreting them as personal failure, Jung would want you to know something crucial. You're not failing. You're succeeding at something far more difficult and valuable than normal social adaptation. You're individuating, becoming authentic, evolving beyond collective programming. And while that process is genuinely challenging, it's also the most important work you'll ever do. What type of evolutionary sign resonated most powerfully with your experience? Share in the comments which of Jung's 7 signs you recognize most strongly. Subscribe for more explorations of Jung's insights about consciousness evolution and authentic development. Remember Jung's ultimate message about evolutionary consciousness: the difficulty you're experiencing now is temporary, but the capabilities you're developing are permanent. You're not breaking down, you're breaking through, and what awaits you on the other side of this breakthrough is worth every moment of difficulty you're experiencing in this transition. You're not too sensitive, too aware, or too different. You're exactly conscious enough, exactly aware enough, exactly different enough to be undergoing genuine evolutionary transformation. Jung believed that people like you are essential for humanity's ongoing development. Your willingness to undergo this difficult transformation, to feel this isolation, to experience this dissolution, is preparing you to eventually help others through similar processes. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.